This program has been made possible in part by the following sponsors. The Trial Lawyers Association of BC. The Vancouver Courier newspaper. My new book about addictions, All the Way Home, Building Recovery That Works. Toward the end of the 5-year run of that wonderfully amusing and dramatic TV series 6 Feet Under, one of the principal characters is buried in a shroud and in a grave that is unlined. So he's going to disappear, dust to dust pretty nicely. Some people may have been horrified by that. I wasn't. I was fascinated by it, and frankly, it's something that suits my imagination. I just want to go out to UBC and lie down in the forest and disappear, become part of the leaves. Green burial, I suspect, and our guest will clear me up on this, has been around since probably the beginning of time, but it is certainly as an ecological movement catching a bit of fire in recent years, and nobody would know more about that than Erik Lees, who is the principal of Lees and Associates, who are landscape architects, and also, I believe, a key player of the Green Burial Society, yes? Are you a charter player?
Indeed, I am, yes.
You got it going, but it was just incorporated just a year ago.
Well, it was incorporated just a year ago, David, but the movement's been ongoing in Canada for some time, and here in BC for 2 or 3 years already. So I'm one of a number of people.
Lots of people who
are charter members.
So describe what it is, first of all. Well, first of all, we should say, traditional burial is, the whole 9 yards, the expensive casket and the giant ceremony and the big burial ground, and then of course the big piece of granite with your name on it.
Typically, although there's plenty of traditional burial that isn't quite as grandiose as all of that, but green burial stands on essentially 5 pillars.
Yes.
The first is there's no embalming. A second, the casket or shroud is very simple. Sometimes even just a quilt or a sheet, or there are now commercially available shrouds.
Yes.
If there is a casket, it's a simple wood casket with very little metal, certainly no imported exotic materials.
And untreated wood.
And untreated, yeah. Sometimes even without any nails, all just glued together and rope handles.
Yeah.
Third, many cemeteries require a concrete liner for reasons which I can go into later. Green burial does not use concrete for the obvious environmental footprint that concrete has, the amount of fossil fuel that it creates that's needed to create the liner. And as well, the memorialization, the headstone that we typically think of in a cemetery is either very simple or maybe even none at all. It might even be just a GPS point in the land.
Wow.
Right? Or a radio frequency interface
device. Excuse me, Henry, while I go on my GPS and see where Dad is buried.
That's exactly it. And nowadays, of course, that's quite doable. And then last, but certainly not least, is some aspect of habitat enhancement.
Yes.
Now, that may mean recreation of the forest that was there,
replanting.
which would happen in this climate.
Yes.
On the prairies, it may be recreation of a grassland environment.
Yes.
So it's all about understanding what that landscape and that ecosystem is about and trying to recreate it.
There's another interesting element in all of that in the memorialization, and that is that reading the materials on your website and on the Green Burial Society website, that often we're not marking Bob Smith. We're marking that this is a green burial site.
And we're marking the area where Bob Smith
Yes.
was buried, because it's really a primal need that we have as individuals to be able to go back to that place.
Yes.
If you've ever been to a Jewish cemetery, recognize the stone.
Oddly enough, I've been to Jewish
I'm
cemeteries.
sure you have, yes.
Yeah.
And that's why, and then that's partly why we leave flowers even
Yes.
long after the burial has occurred. It
Yes.
marks the meaning of that place and
Yes.
and our connection to the person that's gone. And so we do have this atavistic need to
Yes.
mark, and so oftentimes it's a very simple stone, maybe even just a river stone, but some type of marking we realize now is necessary. We wouldn't want to import a stone from India or China because of the fossil fuel impact of that transport
Wow.
to create a big headstone there. That's the main reason
yes.
not to do it for a
Yes.
green burial. There's lots of other reasons why you might choose to do that. But
Well, you often think, just as a citizen roaming the town, you often think, well, aren't we running out of space? I mean, we pay a fortune for 400 square foot condos. Aren't we running out of space to bury people?
we are indeed.
Yes.
We are
You know.
indeed. And we have this unique habit in North America of
Yes.
burying and taking a site in perpetuity.
Yes.
Everywhere else in the world figured this out long ago, and those sites are usually let in some type of fixed term lease or a renewable lease, if you will, right?
Yes.
Certainly that's the way it is in almost all of Northern Europe, and pretty much every other country in the world has some aspect of renewal. Whereas here, we sell that right of interment in perpetuity. Something that has to change, David.
But
Something that has
but
to
it's
change.
very interesting to see how we poor people always try to emulate the rich. You can walk down residential streets and see people with not too much lawn, but some lawn, and you'll see wooden pillars that are imitations, 5 centuries later, of Palladian pillars.
Absolutely,
Right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
so we all want to look like we are colonial masters of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of burial, it seems to me that so many of us want to be King Tut. We really want all that memorialization and all that foo-for-ah, and we want, the big granite, and many communities will have a photograph.
Photograph, yeah,
Yeah.
on the monument. And I don't have a problem with the concept of memorialization and the principle that, even common folk like you and me,
Yeah.
that have made our contribution to society, or anybody else we see out on the street here, for a generation. Aren't we each due at least 25 or 30 years of memory, and maybe our
Something.
grandkids?
Something.
We're not all going to be Winston Churchill and Gandhi, let's face it.
Yeah.
They deserve to be remembered for much longer. So that idea of memorialization that is in some respects ephemeral, and certainly the use of the site,
Yes.
doesn't necessarily have to be in perpetuity. And if the land returns to some semblance of its natural state, then I think that's a good thing.
And the Green Burial Society itself doesn't diminish, denigrate, or laugh at traditional forms of burial.
Absolutely not. No.
It says this is just an alternative.
This is part of the
Yeah.
spectrum of opportunities when it comes time at the end of someone's life to determine just how they're going to, what will the disposition of their body be? Will they be cremated?
Right.
Will they be buried? If they're going to be buried, then how and where will that happen?
One of the things that fascinated me about this, Eric, and one of the reasons I asked you to come on the show, was that I had pretty much decided some years ago that cremation was the route I was going to take as I get closer to my expiry date. But then I read that cremation is not such an ecologically great idea, that we're spewing all kinds of toxins into the air.
You're absolutely right. And back when my mom and dad first joined the Memorial Society of BC back in the late 50s, early 60s,
Yes.
that was the thinking at the time. Two things. One is, why would we consume land for the
Yes.
purposes of burial in perpetuity?
Yeah.
And secondly, surely it's a softer touch.
I've asked you never to call me Shirley in public.
That's true, you did. But the fact is that cremation does consume fossil fuels, the
Yes.
approximate equivalent of driving almost 1,000 kilometers.
Truly?
So that's no small impact. That although the crematoria are much more efficient than they were many years ago, there's still some particulate that is released. And so there is a concern about that. Now we're sitting in in one of the highest cremation rates in North America.
Exactly.
Right here in BC.
Exactly. And Victoria, the city of Victoria, 90% of the people opt for cremation.
Yeah. And
Who
up
knew?
the island, Parksville, it's even higher than that. Across BC, it's crowding 80%.
What's the explanation for that?
Well, you know, we're the left
the
coast.
we're the green people.
We're the green folks, and generally speaking, across North America, right from BC down to California,
Yes.
the trend towards cremation is higher. As you proceed east, and especially southeast,
Yes.
closer into the Bible Belt,
Yes,
and that's often where it is. I just
Yes.
came from Ontario the other day, and there the cremation rate's still only about 62%. Strong Christian community, strong Catholic community, also a strong Muslim and, of course, Jewish
Yes.
faith-based communities. And those traditions are essentially green burial.
As a Jew, I don't even know the rules. I have to ask a rabbi. Is cremation not in my wheelhouse?
No, sir, it is not.
It's not?
It is not.
I had to invite you to tell me that?
Apparently so.
Well, Rabbi Lees, thanks for dropping by. I got to check that out.
Yeah,
I did
you
not- I did
want to
not-
be in full contact. Your casket should be in full contact with the ground. Another tenet of green burial, right?
Yes.
Earth to earth, ashes to ashes.
I have a friend who just raised zillions of dollars to refurbish and beautify some Jewish burial grounds here in the city. So I'll ask her thoughts about all this.
Yes.
Yeah. So, but also reading the materials about this subject, I'm learning that there are guys funeral directors, who work with embalming fluids, and that impacts them, just working with embalming fluids.
Well, it can't. Formaldehyde is a toxic substance, but it is important to recognize that upon contact with the soil, it's more or less neutralized.
Oh, is
and
it?
any
Okay.
modern cemetery
Yes.
is situated well away from the water table and from water courses. So it's not as much of a concern as one might initially think, but the concern about the workers, the embalmers in the preparation room, that's a concern. And there are now green products for embalming that don't include as much or even any formaldehyde. So the whole green burial movement extends right over into the bereavement sector as well.
Yeah, I got to go meet some of these funeral people because, you know, they have to be a different breed of person because most people are horrified by death, except on those rare occasions when we attend a funeral. You know, and by the way, in terms of green burial, you can have an open casket. You can have a viewing.
Oh, certainly, yes,
Yeah.
and that's where the critical role of the funeral director, who I must say they form a critical role in our society.
Yes, of course.
An absolutely essential role. And if there's going to be an open viewing or sometimes visitation, then the funeral director has to be involved. Yes, and they're supportive of that. It's an important part of the grieving process.
It's so interesting that it's such a giant part of, it's the other part of life, and we are so loath to talk about it.
We are death illiterate.
We are death illiterate. That's a good phrase.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. Go plan your funeral, folks, or send us a note to davidberner.com. And this is also the opportunity for those lovely folks who support us here on Shaw Community Television, Cable 4, to say hello. We'll be back with Erik Lees just after this.
This program has been made possible in part by the following sponsors: the Trial Lawyers Association of BC, the Vancouver Courier newspaper, my new book about addictions, All the Way Home, Building Recovery That Works.
Erik Lees is the principal of Lees & Associates, landscape architects, and he's also one of the founding members here in BC of the Green Burial Society. you were saying during the break something very interesting. We were talking about how people are phobic about death and so on, and bodies and funerals. But you're talking about, I was saying that I grew up around lots of deaths, lots of births, lots of all those usual rituals. Fewer and fewer people see death, I think, because it happens in hospitals so much.
It happens in hospitals, although there is a home death movement. That's a subject of another talk. But it used to be that the body would be there for the family to come and see in the front room, in the front parlor. Hence, funeral parlor.
Yes,
right?
But you added the bay windows.
The bay window, if you think about it, is approximately the same length as a casket. That's why.
I came across, when I was 19 and traveling in Spain, I came across a house where a death had just occurred. And it was like a scene out of Zorba the Greek. There were all these women in black shrouds wailing at the top of their lungs around a casket. Unbelievably, we actually did stay at that same house after all that noise quietened down. Green burial, though, was I right at the beginning by saying that green burial in some form or other has been around since time began?
It really has, and we touched on it a moment ago. Really, mostly Muslim burial is about as green as it gets.
Oh, truly.
Save and except for the fact that women are not part of the final interment process. But the actual burial itself is in a shroud. The body is on a plank or a board and lowered into the grave and turned to face Mecca. And then very simple or even no memorialization.
Do people today, I'm sure you've attended and you've witnessed enough green burials now, do people bring, rather than buy a shroud, do they bring their favorite, Jack's favorite blanket?
Or a quilt. But there are commercially available shrouds that are designed exactly for this purpose, because we've speaking for myself, my family wouldn't know how to create a traditional shroud, but when my mom died a couple of years ago, my sister sewed a shroud from some of her fabric remnants. A beautiful shroud, which I told them kind of how to make the thing so we could lift her and handle her in an honorable way. And my brothers and my brother and brother-in-law and I made the casket.
Because you're putting a body in the ground that hasn't been embalmed, do funerals have to happen very quickly?
That's a bit of a fallacy. Embalming started just after the Civil War.
Right.
And there were a lot of bodies going.
Right at the end of it was because of the Civil War.
It really was, and a lot of bodies were being transported a long distance by and in those days, horse and cart. Well. You can imagine what would happen. Well, in this day and age, especially in this climate, it's not as urgent a matter as it once was. And there's other ways if the family can't come for a few days with ice packs and so on to keep the body cool. And there's lots of resources to show people how that happens.
Tell us a bit about we'll come back to this business of burial, but you came to it maybe for personal reasons, I don't know, but certainly because your major life work is landscape architecture, and you have been very diligent and or hardworking, and or lucky, I was going to say, in terms of having projects all across Canada, in Ghana, all over the world, including great memorial sites right here in town.
I'm incredibly blessed with the opportunity to serve the community in this way and to connect with people and talk about meaningful landscapes and meaningful memorials. It's an aspect of our profession that we're trained about, but rarely are we able to speak in this kind of language about the place.
What did you do with the Maru boat incident and with the Air India incident? Did you do the whole design?
Well, our firm did, and I'm one member of a very talented team here in Vancouver with another office in Toronto, and this is one of our main areas of specialization. In both of those cases, we worked very closely with the South Asian community to develop those memorials. The Air India Memorial, of course, did memorialize the death of all the people that died in that crash. The Komagata Maru is really more of a commemorative site. which commemorates a really unfortunate incident in our country's history. So the conversation between commemoration and memorials is something that's intrigued us an awful lot over the last
It seems to me, Eric, that there's a almost standard public response to these kinds of memorials, like the Twin Towers Memorial in New York, and like Vietnamese soldiers, American soldiers who were killed in Vietnam, and so on. And here, the HIV wall, and so that kind of thing. It seems to me that when these things first come up, a lot of us are kind of mean-spirited, and we quibble, well, it didn't do this, or it didn't do that, or I'm not sure that's told the story, or blah, blah, blah. But it doesn't take long, I think, for everybody to settle down and go, boy, this is pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah. Yeah,
it's kind of beautiful stuff.
It has a visceral reaction. It brings us together as a community.
Yeah.
And that's the power of doing these things in public places.
So, for example, when you did the Air India, how do you even begin? I'm going to guess that of course you have to be given a site, but I'm assuming that one of the things you do is talk to an awful lot of people who are families of victims and so on.
Read the stories, understand what those narratives were, understand what some of the touchstones in that experience were.
Yeah.
And also, we talked earlier about being death illiterate.
Yes.
We're also memorial illiterate. Very few of us can name anything other than a bronze plaque. That's your classic stereotypical form of memorialization.
Yes.
So one of the things we do is we show things like the Vietnam War Memorial, which is a landscape installation. We show what we call precedent examples of meaningful, powerful landscapes that
Yes.
really tell the story, oftentimes in a less literal way than metaphoric.
Yeah, and you have to make really interesting choices about materials, and as you said, some people, will bury the dead in such a way that they're facing Mecca. Well, similarly with a memorial, you have to decide which way is the sun going,
Yeah.
right? All of those things come into consideration.
Durability.
Durability, yeah.
Durability is really
What is this? Is this
Yeah.
metal? Is it granite? How long is it going to stick around? Will it stand up
Yeah.
to really bad weather?
Yeah, how do we tell the story through shape, form, and color and texture, and just enough text to
Yes.
explain the facts, and then let people experience
Without
the
it
rest.
becoming a novel.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
And
leaving-
without hitting them over the head.
Yeah, exactly. Leaving room for people to reflect, let their own thoughts.
Yeah, and this is part of the real value of green burial.
Right.
Is that it is a subtle, understated type of landscape where in 20, 30, 40, 100 years' time, you may walk through there and you may not even know that this is a sacred ground, except for a few clues. Beautiful piece of sculpture, an interesting gate, maybe a memorial wall, but the landscape itself is just emerging back out of the ground.
Yeah, I don't know if I just think differently, but I think I think about my mother who died some years ago, and I would be perfectly happy to go to the site without needing that gravestone.
And the key thing is going to the site.
Yes.
Because not just you, but your grandchildren and their grandchildren.
Yes.
With cremation, we've just been cremated, which often means very simply, very quickly, and with no memorialization at all. And so consequently, we've lost this whole generation of the community narrative because there isn't any memorialization, or at least
Yes.
any spot. Yes, off the top of the mountain or out at the lake or down at the cottage, that's where we know Grandpa, or at least we know where Grandpa, but our great-grandchildren, where do they go to understand their family?
And it's very interesting on the Green Burial. I think it's on the Green Burial Society website. One of the choices on the menu is locations of who does this, and it's not just some specific places like woodlands and so on, but lots of traditional burial grounds now have green burial options.
Yeah, right here in Vancouver, you don't need a cement liner.
Yeah.
You can do a very simple casket or shroud. The manager there, Glenn Hodges, is one of the leaders in Canada actually in managing cemeteries in an enlightened, innovative way. And Vancouver is one of the few places where after 40 years the grave is available for use again.
Aha.
So We don't call it renewable lease yet, but for all intents and purposes, it is. And it's a wonderful model that we should all be looking at much more closely.
Have you had any serious resistance from people, from individuals or groups?
Well, there's a lot of questions. We're still defining what green burial means, just as we did at the top of the show. Understanding which of those 5 pillars are most important and how do we bring those into traditional cemeteries. Many of the suppliers are anxious, right? Because we're no longer selling a mahogany casket.
Yes.
But as you know, there's lots of wonderful, simple wood caskets or wicker caskets or
Absolutely.
shrouds. So
I should have asked, are there special Aboriginal considerations? Is the Aboriginal community jumping on this?
the Aboriginal community has really been doing green burial since day one.
That's what I was...
You know, what is old is new again, is what you were saying earlier. And it's very much the case. Country burial, Aboriginal burial, Muslim, Jewish burial, they're all much greener than if you will, the normal run-of-the-mill type of burial.
Eric, thanks so much. I think it's really interesting. I know you got the election all wrong, but I don't know that at all. But what you predict, this is just going to keep going. There's just going to be more and more people doing
I
this,
think
aren't
so.
there?
As the baby boomers age, we're looking for new ways of doing things.
Dynamite.
David.
Thanks so much. All right. Fascinating stuff. We don't like to look at these things, but we ought to. So next week, let's see if I can read it off there. Chris Friesen, Chair, Canadian Immigrant Settlement Sector Alliance. The question is, what are we doing in terms of the Syrian immigration crisis? Are we doing enough, too much, and so on? We'll find out next week. Thanks so much for being with us. Have a good evening.